Mr. Kirby, how much pressure is the administration under from members of Congress and elsewhere who say that military support for Ukraine is a waste of US taxpayers' money?
Well, we have seen a growing number of particularly House Republicans criticize future spending and support for Ukraine. But I would tell you a couple of things. First of all, the support from Capitol Hill remains very, very strong, not just from a bicameral perspective, but a bipartisan one. And the House leadership, from Speaker McCarthy right on down, of the relevant committees that have oversight over support for Ukraine, are also very supportive. So it's a small group of very vocal, very right-wing House Republicans that continue to resist additional support for Ukraine. But the president's confident that the support that we're getting from the leadership, again, in both chambers, remains high.
Vivek Viraswamy says that support for Ukraine is disastrous and a distraction from US domestic issues. Is he right?
Well, I think you can understand that I'm not going to wade into electoral politics. I can't do that here from the National Security Council. All I can tell you is that what's happening in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. Now, first and foremost, it is. You've got thousands of people that have been killed or wounded. You've got people flung from their homes. You have young children being ripped from their families and sent to concentration camps in Russian-occupied territory. I mean, it's a brutal war. So obviously, first and foremost, it's happening there. But it goes beyond that. If we just walk away, and this is the case that President Biden has made to the American people, if we just walk away from this, if we just let Putin have Ukraine, where does it stop? Because the next stop is right on the eastern flank of NATO. And if people are worried about the cost in blood and treasure on this war in Ukraine, then think about how much more exorbitant that cost is going to be if we walk away and allow Mr. Putin to be encouraged to continue to take more territory or to threaten NATO's eastern flank.
You talk about NATO's eastern flank there. So would you support NATO taking action to provide air defense for NATO members on NATO territory that is currently being physically hit by Russian munitions? I'm thinking of Romania.
Well, look, that's a decision for the alliance, not for the United States to make. We have bolstered air policing efforts along that eastern flank. We have moved aircraft around that eastern flank. We have added aircraft to the eastern flank and to the eastern flank nations, and we're going to continue to work in lockstep with our NATO allies about proper air policing capabilities. But I don't think it's useful to get into a hypothetical here about actual self-defense operations, and getting ahead of where the alliance might be.
In an interview yesterday with my colleague Francis Durnley, Senator Mitt Romney said that the 5% the US is spending, 5% of the defense budget the US is spending on support for Ukraine is a wise investment to decimate, his words, decimate the Russian army. Would you like other NATO members to make a similar sort of commitment, same level in their defense budgets?
We are leaving it to each country that's supporting Ukraine. And I know you asked about NATO, but I think it's important to remember there are some 50 countries around the world, well beyond just the NATO alliance, that are supporting Ukraine in various forms, whether it's financial assistance, humanitarian assistance, or security assistance. In fact, next week, Secretary of Defense Austin will be going back to Ramstein again for yet another meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group to elicit more support. And we have been, from the very beginning, we've been very conscious about leaving it to each individual nation to determine what they can provide, not just from a financial perspective, but from a content perspective. It's up to them. These are sovereign decisions. We're not arm twisting. We're not cajoling. We're not trying to force anybody's hand. We want every nation around the world who can and will support Ukraine to do it in a way that's consistent with their own values and their own economies and their own popular will. The whole fight in Ukraine is about the idea of sovereignty, and it would be really ironic and hypocritical for the United States, while we're trying to support Ukraine's sovereignty and right to exist as a nation state, to then try to arm twist other nations to do more than they're already doing.
Yeah, but friends can have very frank discussions with each other and say, look, I think you need to step up a little bit more here.
We have had And we'll continue to have conversations with all these allies and partners, all 50 of them, as we will do in Germany next week, and we'll certainly do privately, to see what they can do. I'm not saying that we aren't talking to them individually about capabilities they might have that we don't have. For instance, I mean, so much of the systems that the Ukrainians use are based on old Soviet systems, old Russian systems. Now, they are transitioning more and more to Western NATO interoperable systems, but they still operate a lot of that. So, yes, we're going to some countries that have systems that the Ukrainians can use and use quickly and seeing what they can do to provide it. I'm not saying we're not having those conversations or asking for that support, but we aren't arm twisting.
Yeah. But I mean, there is also a scale thing here. I was at Picatinny Arsenal yesterday, and General John Rhyme, who's the commanding general there, was saying how they are on course to very, very quickly be up from the circa 10,000 155 mil shells they're producing a month now to 86,000. They've got a very clear path. That's funded. The processes are there. 86,000 a month. That's only about half of what Russia is expected to be able to produce next year. So, you're doing a lot of heavy lifting, the US. Is it not time for the rest, the other external facing supporting nations for Ukraine to also just do a little bit more?
Again, every nation has to decide for itself. There has been a lot of burden sharing here. And one of the reasons why, again, Secretary Austin's going back to Germany is to see if he can solicit more help from more nations. So we want every nation that's willing and able to do what they can. And we've made the commitment. President Biden has said it many, many times. We're with this for as long as it takes. We'll support Ukraine. And so we're trying to lead by example.
When you say, and President Biden has said, as long as it takes, some people, there is the argument that by not going all in with aid, military aid, has meant that the war is longer than it may have been. Do you accept that argument? Do you think that the arguments for not supplying ATACMS and other sophisticated niche military hardware no longer stand up against this idea that it's provocative and escalatory?
We have evolved the capabilities that we have provided Ukraine as the war itself evolved. So when it kicked off 18 months ago, what was everybody talking about? Stinger air defense, shoulder-fired missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, small arms and ammunition, tactical vehicles, because Putin was making his move on Kyiv through a ground convoy. Then, when Mr. Putin couldn't take Kyiv and he pulled all his troops out to the north to refit and reman, what did he do? He came back into the Donbass area. And so what was needed then? Artillery. And air defense, but mostly artillery and these long-range rocket systems. And so the United States led the world in providing that. Air defense has, in the last 6-8 months, become an even more acute need as Russia continues to rain drones and missiles down on civilian infrastructure, and so we stepped up with Patriot missiles and other NASAMS, as we call them, other short and medium-range air defense. So we have evolved the capabilities as the war has evolved, and we believe that's the right course because the war has changed in its nature.
Agreed, but the model you've just described does suggest that Russia has the momentum there. You're responding
I would disagree with that 100%.
Well, you're responding to what they've done instead of saying, let's get ahead of that. So, for example, why are we not now having the discussion about ATACMS? Why is the discussion about allowing Ukraine to take the war inside Russia? Why does that still seem to be...
So there's a lot there. Let me unpack this. So, first of all, it's not about reacting to what Russia's doing. It's reacting to what is the needs on the battlefield, and they change. And some of these capabilities that we're giving Ukraine are for them to take the offense, for them to move on Russian positions. And they are. This counteroffensive is making some progress. Is it going as far as fast as the Ukrainians would like? They'd be the first to tell you that it's not. But we are moving in that direction. Again, we will continue to evolve that as needed. On ATACMS, there has been a long conversation here in the United States about those long-range cruise missiles. And that conversation is ongoing even as you and I are speaking today. No decision has been made yet. The president hasn't said he'll do it, but he continues to want the interagency, the Defense Department, the State Department, here at the National Security Council, to consider ATACMS, and we're doing that. They are not off the table.
Do you think strongly...
Oh, but I also wanted to, sorry to interrupt, because you also asked about, attacks inside Russia. Let me just make that point, and I'll make it crystal clear. Still today, we do not encourage, and we do not engender attacks inside Russian territory.
Why?
We believe that the war is in Ukraine, and we believe that that's where Ukraine should be focusing on the Russian-occupied areas inside Ukraine. And we believe that's where the fight is, and that's where we want the focus to be. Now, look, President Zelensky is the commander-in-chief of his armed forces. He gets to determine where he strikes and where he doesn't strike. We provide him the capabilities, but ultimately the decisions are for him. Now, we have made it clear that we don't want to see U.S.-provided capabilities striking inside Russia. We also have to be concerned, and unapologetically so, about the potential risks of escalation here. I think we could all agree that doing exactly what Putin says this war, making this a proxy war, making it about the West versus Russia, NATO versus Russia, which is exactly his ridiculous argument, proving that to be the case by engendering and encouraging attacks on Russia and escalating this conflict would not be good, not only for the people of Ukraine, but it wouldn't be good for our national security interests, it wouldn't be good for our allies and our partners.
And yet, just the last point on this, the last time there was a clear invasion of one country against another and the military force was used to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait back in the early 90s, the very first thing that happened in that campaign was areas of Baghdad and elsewhere were hit. So the idea of ejecting forces from a piece of territory does not also require military action elsewhere inside that sovereign country. That is a false premise, is it not?
No, I would disagree with you. Look, again, that's a false comparison I think you're making there. Russia is a major nuclear power, and Mr. Putin has rattled the sabers with some reckless nuclear rhetoric, and they have a much bigger, much more capable military than Saddam Hussein did. So it's a false comparison, and I don't think using historical examples in this case really is relevant. We want Ukraine to succeed on the battlefield, and no nation has done more than the United States to help them succeed. And they are making progress. So we stand by the support that we're going to give Ukraine, that we have and we will continue to give Ukraine. But we also stand by the fundamental belief that World War III is not in anybody's best interest.
Would stronger deterrence messaging from the West have made any difference at all, do you think, to Putin's decision to invade?
You know, that's a difficult thing to answer. I mean, each of those situations was unique. I can't speak for the decision-making of previous administrations or the previous leadership of our allies and partners during this. All I can tell you is that as he began to build up his forces in the fall and the winter before he moved across that line, we certainly made it clear to Mr. Putin that there would be ramifications and repercussions. We certainly made it clear that Russia will be held accountable and pressure would be put on Russia. And we have done that. Now, he made the decision to move across that line and invade a neighboring country, and we have done everything we can to help the Ukrainians repel that invasion.
Now, whether we like it or not, Russia is a P5 member of the United Nations Security Council, and therefore a pillar in the international security framework. But the UN has also sanctioned North Korea for arms munition issues. And Russia is talking to North Korea about rearmament. So that architecture surely is no longer fit for purpose.
And who voted for that, by the way?
Exactly.
Yeah, they did.
So if Russia can vote for that and yet still in the last couple of days have discussions about does that not show that the architecture is just no longer fit for purpose?
Well, I think President Biden, and you'll hear him talk about this a little bit more next week. I mean, we've been clear that we believe that it is time to take a look at the architecture of the Security Council. We believe it should be more inclusive and more comprehensive. I don't think we have an issue with the idea of taking a look at the architecture itself.
In terms of more members or the veto, or what do you think?
Well, I think we just think it's time to have a discussion about the architecture and the organization. And as I said, more inclusive. I think President Biden and the United States would support more members.
How does China not emerge stronger from this war?
President Biden's talked about this too. President Xi has issues at home. He's got an economy that's struggling. He's got a population at home that's becoming increasingly restless. As the president said, that he wouldn't want to trade places with President Xi, and probably no other world leader would either. We'll see. China could, they could play a constructive role here, because there's not too many countries that have any important influence or access to President Putin. China's one of them. President Xi's one of them. And we've made it clear to the PRC that if they want to take a constructive role, or if they want to get involved in helping end this war, we would welcome that, as long as they do it in a way that is in keeping with the UN Charter, respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and as long as it includes Ukrainian perspectives. So we were glad that that President Xi and President Zelensky had a chance to talk several months ago. We were glad when the Chinese put forward an envoy to Ukraine. So it's important for them to have those perspectives. China could play a role. I don't know whether you're saying they're going to come out stronger or weaker here. They've got their own domestic problems to deal with, but they could play a role here in helping to end this war.
When I say stronger, I mean the challenge to the international rules-based order that is ongoing in Ukraine, if it is allowed to succeed, and the post-war, post-Second World War settlement and the architecture that we've enjoyed, the peace we've enjoyed for years, China is trying to change that. Russia is violating it now, and if it is not stamped on, then we just move away from this architecture, move towards a world of might is right.
We don't see that happening. In the UN, 143 nations condemned Russia's aggression. 143 out of 190 plus, that ain't too bad. So it's difficult to see any scenario in which the rules-based order is just going to get tossed over the transom. Yes, you're right. China would like to see that happen. So would Russia. Of the two countries, China's really the only ones, not only with the intent, but the potential means to move in that direction. But we haven't seen that happen. And it would also further isolate Beijing, and I think you would see the international community react swiftly against that.
Now, yesterday also with Francis Durnley, Mitt Romney said that when one is in one's 80s, that is too old for public office. I mean, do you think there's the age issue, as it's been raised about President Biden and possible, Mr. Trump again? Do you think the whole age thing has been overblown, and it's the person and their capabilities that's important, or do you think age is a relevant subject to be discussed?
The president believes that his age gives him wisdom and experience. And when just think about the things you and I were talking about in the last 15 minutes. This is complicated stuff, and it's dangerous stuff. And you want somebody at the helm, a commander-in-chief, who understands these leaders, who understands these issues, who has been around the world, who has these relationships. There is no question. And I was just on the trip with the president to the G20 and to Vietnam, 5 days around the world. He had some long days, and he had some significant discussions, and we got an awful lot done. And it's difficult to see how somebody with less experience, less wisdom, and fewer relationships could do as much as President Biden did just on that trip or in the last 2.5 years. He's proud of that wisdom that his age has given him and his time in public service has given him. And he's proud of the experience that he brings to some very meaty, very weighty, very significant national security issues.
And will President Biden be able to concentrate on a potential second term in office if his son is convicted of the charges laid against him today?
The president loves his son and is supporting his son. His son's gone through an awful lot, and his parents are right there with him, and that's not going to change. He's a father, and he has been a son himself, and that's where his head is with his family. But it's also very much on the country's business, and you don't have to look any further than, again, just what's happened in the last couple of weeks and what's going to happen next week up in New York City at the UN General Assembly, and see that this is a president who, as a loving father, can also be a very determined, very experienced, very wise, and very dedicated public servant.